April 2nd, 2015. The day the Black Rock Mountain adventure dropped, and the eventual reign of the oppressive, dominating Grim Patron warrior began. Over the 10 years of Hearthstone, we've seen many decks that have tipped the scales of power too far and had to be either toned back or utterly gutted. Today, we're taking a look back at once oppressive decks that are now bad. We'll take a look at their history, meta dominance, and we'll play some games of each to answer the question, which of the iconic once oppressive decks is the least doo-doo now? We'll start with Day 1 Demon Hunter. Immediately upon queuing up some games with this deck, I have this immediate feeling of dread from the sheer metric tons that my cards weigh. In terms of speed, it's like every card has to be dragged through the mud in order to be played. They all feel like they cost at least 1, maybe 2 more mana than they should, and it seems like 4 seconds into each of these 10 games that I played with this deck that I'd be lucky to win even one game. I'm either passing or playing one card a turn, and every turn I fall further and further behind. It's like being teased with the opportunity to play Hearthstone, but in reality, it's my opponent's turn forever. I'm just waiting in line while I wait for them to sling lots of cards. To say it was the polar opposite when Demon Hunter came out would be an understatement. This deck, and ones like it, quickly propelled the whole Demon Hunter class to a 55% class win rate, and resulted in no other class in the entire game having even 45%. It was bonkers levels of oppressive. Unlike other decks, this deck isn't iconic for how long it was around or for how nostalgic people are for it. It's iconic because of the meta warp and how the deck got nerfed. After just one day, 4 cards got emergency nerfed in an attempt to even out the playing field. Because you see, this wasn't just a deck being nerfed. This was the entire class. They were nerfing the foundations that the class was built on. The essential core cards, the initiate cards, the framework of the class, the whole class was being brought down a peg. Many consider this deck to be the most oppressive deck of all time, but that's unlikely, as the name is very literal here. Day 1 Demon Hunter. You see, Day 1 Demon Hunter was only what the deck looked like on Day 1. Here's a Reddit post that sums it up nicely. The effed up thing about Day 1 Demon Hunter is that because it was only Day 1, the popular lists were not even close to being fully optimized. A lot of people were just playing the basic deck and still winning a bunch. This Reddit post sums it up nicely. Essentially what they're saying is that because it was only Day 1, the deck that we're talking about here was far from optimized, and it didn't matter. You just won every game you played, basically. That wasn't the mirror. They were playing cards like Imprisoned Enteta, enough to get the card emergency nerfed, but given how bad it is at 6, this user as well as me think that it probably sucked even at 5. But they just had to nerf things so fast that they went for that card. Basically, what I'm saying is the most oppressive deck isn't Day 1 Demon Hunter. It's the deck that would have eventually been discovered if Day 1 Demon Hunter didn't get nerfed. That's the neat thing. The most oppressive deck is always the next one. And for us, it's Pirate Warrior. Specifically for this video, Pirate Warrior in Gadgetzan after Patches the Pirate had just come out. Pirate Warrior has had many iterations over the years in both Standard and Wild. We're going back to where it all began, when our fearless leader Patches was still in charge. Upon release of the Mean Streets of Gadgetzan expansion, Patches and his band of pirates began terrorizing Ladder as one of the best decks. The player's only choice was to join them or find a way to beat them. Very familiar looking deck to many, especially those that play Wild, as a lot of the good pirate package has stuck around for many years. Patches, as I'm sure most of you know, offered many things. It offered immediate board presence, cheap damage, and it even thinned your deck. A lot of people didn't realize at first just how good this card was, but it was so good back in the day that even non-aggro decks, even non-pirate decks, were running Patches in the deck along with a few other pirates like South Sea Captain in order to just get the deck thinning and the free 2/2 with charge. That's how strong Patches was at this time. But the best use for Patches was, of course, Pirate Warrior. From the combination of Small Time Buccaneer being a 3/2, which back in the day for a 1-drop was nuts, along with Patches, N'Zoth's First Mate, and many other good pirate synergies. This list today is actually still pretty solid. Obviously, if you wanted to maximize your win rate, you'd put in new pirate tools such as the questline and other effective pirates. But all in all, even with this exact 30 cards, you can still win a few fair amount of games, as a lot of this stuff is still very efficient and can still catch people off guard. We don't need to talk about Pirate Warrior too much. You've all seen it. You play lots of pirates, you have lots of burst, you try to kill your opponent. It's pretty simple, pretty basic Hearthstone. A lot of people love it, a lot of people probably don't. Nothing too special there. But this deck was an absolute terrorizer of the ladder. If you weren't playing it, you weren't going to do as well as those who were, but if you really wanted to, you could try to play something that was only good because it specifically beat this deck. And one of those decks at the time just so happened to become an iconic powerhouse of its own. We're of course talking about Aggro Shaman. Some may remember this era as Shaman Stone. Yes, not Hearthstone, Shaman Stone, because if you weren't playing Shaman, you weren't really playing. You certainly weren't winning. This deck Loaded up with our favorite 2-mana 3/4 and our favorite 4-mana 7/7. Was everything right about aggro and everything wrong with Hearthstone at the time? This is a great example of a deck that runs Patches the Pirate despite not being an actual pirate deck. In this case, it runs Small Time Buccaneer and South Sea Deckhand, which are good with weapons and allows it to pull Patches as just a few card package. The reason that this deck was so good and started being good around the time of Pirate Warrior though is cards like Maelstrom Portal, which allowed this aggro deck to run a cheap control card to counter the other aggro deck in Pirate Warrior. But as the time went on, this deck just kept getting better and it was no longer just a deck that was good against Pirate Warrior. It soon took over all of Hearthstone. Turns out, playing overstated minions while killing your opponent and having effective burst and damage is pretty solid. You don't get the whole game called Shaman Stone for nothing. This deck had a positive win rate into everything and really only lost if the right Reno decks got the right amount of control and healing early enough. The deck was so good that many cards, like Flame Wreathed Faceless, are still popular memes and references to this day, because boy were people sick of seeing him on turn 4. Because, like I said earlier, the Hearthstone devs didn't used to nerf things, so you didn't just have whole expansion cycles would have Flame Wreathed Faithless as the best card. You'd have as long as it took for that card to either rotate or be power crept. They didn't used to just destroy powerful cards so that the new expansion could be the only thing worth doing like they do now. Then it was expansions merging with other expansions, and whatever happened to be the best was the best. Sometimes they'd tone things down, but very, very rarely. This deck's similar to the last one though, so we don't need to ramble for too much longer. It's an aggro deck. It has efficient minions with efficient stats. It has efficient burst, and it kills you. And why a deck that does that is also allowed to have oversided minions is beyond me, especially for the time. But that's it. I mean, Shaman Stone, Aggro Shaman. One of the iconic decks that is now doo-doo. Today, this deck's a bit too slow, but I did win a game on turn 3, which was pretty cool. And to really live up to nostalgia, I lost a game to Reno Jackson, but because it's new times, they didn't heal for 29. They healed for 34, because Renathal was nerfed when I played this particular game. All in all, pretty solid deck, pretty fun trip down memory lane, but I'm okay with this deck not being particularly amazing right now, I suppose. Next up is the Grand Tournament Secret Paladin. That's right, you didn't think I'd leave our good friend Mysterious Challenger off this list, did you? But before we get to him, let's talk about the strengths of Secret Paladin and what this deck was. I think it's best described as a value, tempo, resilient deck. It isn't value like your typical control arena decks are that are trying to just jack your deck full of strong, powerful, high-cost things that give you lots of other things. No. What this deck was is that compared to other mid-range decks, it had plenty of draw, plenty of divine shields, plenty of death rattles to always give you card advantage, tempo advantage, and board advantage. With that tempo and board advantage, you'd of course be resilient to their attempts to stop you through their control AoEs and their removal. And if all of that wasn't enough, you haven't won yet through just good quality cards being played out in a mid-range style. You of course have Mysterious Challenger. Mysterious Challenger won half or more of the games in this deck on his own. Much like Patches, a 1-mana 1/1 sucks. In this case, a 6-mana 6/6 sucks, but you get a whole lot more than that. Here, not only do you get 5 secrets immediately in play, which is like sort of 5 mana's worth, but you also thin those cards from your deck, so you're not top decking turn 5 or later a 1-mana secret that's just kind of met on its own. So not only do you put them in play, get the immediate effects of them to protect your board as well as potentially buff it if the right things happen, but you also thin your deck so you're more likely to continue to have good, powerful cards that will allow you to refill and continue to put threats in play. This deck currently not actually that bad. Some of it's okay. Some of the minions are still alright. I won a couple of games, and much like my experience with Shaman, I lost a couple of games to Reno. So really it's like, hey, you know, throw me right back in time, you know? This deck is like probably the quintessential deck that just started mid-range as an archetype, essentially. Like, it's just like playing a card a turn. They get increasingly cooler until you eventually win, and they're just really decent compared to the other cards in the game on a 1-to-1 basis. You're more likely to win than you weren't. Nowadays though, people are playing a whole lot more than one card against me a turn. Their cards are often just better on their own in a 1-to-1 when they're playing 6 anyway, and so unless my opponent kind of doesn't do a whole lot, not very likely to win with. But compared to some of the other ones in this video, this is one of the better ones I think right now, which is quite interesting, and this hasn't been updated. You could probably make a fairly alright passable deck with this style, and at least, you know, win some games. Another big thing with this deck is that it was really cheap at a time where not a lot of people spent money on the game and a lot of people played it. So you are more often than not, for power level reasons and for cost reasons, likely to see a Secret Paladin in your games on any given day on ladder. And boy, oh boy, was it miserable. Like, sure, losing, not fun. Losing to aggro mid-range people who just pile on, not that fun. But that's whatever, that's Hearthstone. What is just horrible, just terrible, criminal is secrets. They're the absolute worst. I despise them with a bloody Undertaker Hunter. Undertaker Hunter, probably the oldest oppressive deck that has ever existed. Undertaker came out with the release of the Curse of Naxxramas expansion back in 2014, which is crazy. Because that's like, you know, 10 years ago, which is crazy to think about. The way the deck worked was simple. You play Undertaker on one and you hope it doesn't die. You then follow it up by curving out Death Rattle minions every turn, flooding your board not only with resilient Death Rattle minions, but also buffing your Undertaker as you go, coining the nickname for Undertaker, 1-mana Yeti. The reason it became a Hunter deck as opposed to any other class, because Undertaker is a neutral card, is because of cards like Web Spinner and Mad Scientist. Mad Scientist is another neutral card, but it's particularly good in Hunter to pull out secrets, and Web Spinner was one of the cheaper good Death Rattles of the time. If you're wondering how on earth this deck was anything special, you're not alone. You see, back in the day, back when Naxxramas came out, all you had at your disposal was the classic cards in the game. Nowadays, there's over 5,000 Hearthstone cards, so I can think of about 2,500 ways to deal with an Undertaker on turn 1, or 2, or 3. But back then, if you didn't have like Fiery War Axe, there wasn't a whole lot you could do to deal with this Undertaker. And so if they went first and they had it on 1, the percentage chance that they won the game was astronomical. There just wasn't anything you could do. This is one of those decks looking back where it's kind of hard without that context to understand how it could be even that good, because today the card, even in its unnerved state, is really just unplayable even in aggro decks. There's just not enough good Death Rattles and good enough Undertaker support to have any chance against the mountains of removal that we have in the game today. But back then, if you could stick your Undertaker, it was essentially a 1-mana Yeti, because it would very quickly grow out of control and you would not even be able to really come back with removal against it, because if you used AoE, you're going to end up hitting all those Death Rattles that they've used to buff the Undertaker, and so they're still going to have a board and still cheat secrets and stuff into play, and so you're really likely not going to be able to catch back up enough to stabilize if you even do manage to somehow find an answer to that Undertaker. That was it. That was the whole premise of the deck. You just hope you got the Undertaker early, and if you did, you likely won. If you didn't, you still have decent cards for the time to have a chance to win, but it was called Undertaker Hunter for a reason. That was a card you wanted. You full mulliganed for it. If you found it, you're happy. If you didn't, you're not so happy, and you go from there. It's your stereotypical early Hunter deck. You try to kill the opponent, you try to overwhelm them, and no better way to do that than putting out an unkillable minion that scales both attack and health in a time where there really wasn't much you could do about it. With that said, Undertaker Hunter, one of the more iconic decks when you think of broken decks in the past, so I had to include it. And while playing it today, there was a couple times where it looked like I would have a chance to win, but even with like a few minions in play and following it up with Loatheb on 5 when they were in range, the problem is my opponents these days just have like a million answers, or in this case, double my mana and can just play a minion that will remove all of my stuff, which isn't so hot. Definitely not one of the better decks today, but you could take a lot of the shell from this deck and make a pretty passable one when compared to the others. It's probably better than Demon Hunter, it's probably better than Shaman, but it's certainly not better than Paladin or Warrior. But some games, you'll get the right curve, you'll get the right minions, your Undertaker may live, and you'll have a decent chance of at least winning something. And last but not least, as mentioned originally, our final deck is Grim Patron Warrior. Before the War Song got War Song, this is a deck that people have revisited many times over the years. Why? Because it's still the most infamous nerf in Hearthstone history. Never before have we had a card get nerfed, a singular card in a patch, and receive dozens upon dozens of news articles, from gaming news to industry news to just popular culture news. They were everywhere. There was like 30 articles that this card finally got nerfed. Not Grim Patron, but Warsong Commander. The card in the deck that gave Grim Patron and all the Grim Patron copies charge and allowed them to go straight to the opponent's face. This deck now is actually back to where it was. It was nerfed and gutted and, well, Warsonged for many, many years. If you've ever wondered why people sometimes say Warsonged when they're talking about a card that gets completely reworked when it gets nerfed, is because it's a callback to this card. They didn't just nerf Warsong Commander, they sent him to the same farm as your childhood pet. This card had no resemblance to the card it used to be except for the name and the art. The text was just completely random. It may as well have been AI generated. As for the deck though, very, very simple. The biggest redeeming factor of this deck was that it was actually fairly high skill cap intensive. So you were rewarded for playing it well, and you didn't do as well if you didn't play it as well, and so it was a lot of fun for a lot of people. But with any of the decks on this list, they're iconic and oppressive. You're gonna have a lot of people unhappy with them and who don't find them fun. The way the deck works was simple. You'd put Warsong in play, you'd follow it up with Grim Patron, and you'd use things like Inner Rage, Whirlwind, the Death Rattle of Deathspite, etc. to make many copies of Grim Patron to either infinitely clear a board or to send 6 3/3s to the face. You could also use things like Frothing Berserker, who when in play is a 2-attack minion, so Warsong Commander gives him charge. You can then use those Inner Rages and those Whirlwinds to make more Grim Patrons, but while all of these things are making new Grim Patrons and all these minions are taking damage, your Frothing Berserker is gaining gaining attack. It doesn't lose charge when it goes above 3 attacks. It gets permanently given charge, and then its attack grows. So you do enough war winds and enough inner rages and enough trading of your Grim Patrons to make other Grim Patrons and have 2 minions take damage every time you trade, that your Frothing Berserker would have quite easily 30 attack, and you would just kill your opponent immediately. That was the deck. That's where the infamous songs and memes come from. Everyone get in here. That's what Grim Patron says when it generates another Grim Patron. And this deck terrorized the ladder, dominated the meme culture, and was just all in all a really popular, really well-made card and deck. But unfortunately for its lovers, it was too oppressive and too strong. And when it finally got nerfed, was praised in news for days to come, because my goodness, this was a game changer. Not only did they finally nerf something, but they absolutely destroyed it. They violated it. This deck today, as well as last year when someone revisited it, and the year before that, because it gets revisited all the time, as I said, is okay. It's a fine deck, except like it's really expensive to play a 5-mana 3/3 and do this stuff. You really don't have time to do much of it. But if you get the right matchups, you get the right situations, or if you really want to relive it, the best way to do it is to just play the Innkeeper. And one of the hands is actually Grim Patron Warrior. That's the best way to do it. But if you're gonna play the actual deck, it's all right, but it's pretty bad. But it's a nice trip down memory lane since they finally unnerfed Warsong Commander, so you can play it in all its glory. You can play an updated version of it if you want. It's got some cool tools. It can do some cool things. But really, it's on this list because of how iconic it used to be and how infamous the nerf still is to this day. That wraps up one suppressive decks that are now bad. Now we just need to answer which of these decks is the least bad now. I think I was generally too nice about how all of these decks would perform now in my commentary, even the Demon Hunter. I think if you played 10 games with any of these, you should be stoked to win 3 times. And with that said, the only deck I managed to do that with was the Secret Paladin. So it gets my seal of approval. I'm JordanMG. Thanks for watching.